take place to begin its descent toward the Kennedy Space Center for the first of 2 opportunities available for a landing in Florida by the shuttle today. Here in Mission Control, flight controllers getting final updates on the weather and update on observations of approaches to the runway from Chief Astronaut Kent Rominger, who's been flying the shuttle training aircraft at the Kennedy Space Center, flying practice approaches to the shuttle runway. Of concern during the morning has been fog that has been shown to dissipate around Kennedy. Whether or not that is dissipating quickly enough is the question that flight controllers are getting updates on. Also continuing to evaluate which runway would be chosen for Columbia's descent, runway 33 end of the shuttle landing facility or runway 15. This is a live view of the shuttle runway as seen from a camera atop the vehicle assembly building at the Kennedy Space Center. The Space Shuttle Columbia at present 171 miles above the southern tip of Africa, 16 minutes away from an engine firing that would begin its trip home after 16 days of around-the-clock science in orbit. This is Mission Control Houston, 174 miles above the Indian Ocean, just off the east coast of Africa. Columbia is in the proper orientation for a firing by its twin orbital maneuvering system engines that would begin its descent from orbit, a return to Florida this morning. That would be a 2-minute, 38-second long firing of its orbital maneuvering system engines to begin that descent. On board, the crew has completed preparations for landing, all of that going like clockwork throughout the morning, closing up their science work in the wee hours this morning, shutting the hatch to the Space Hab module that was the center of most of the 80 scientific investigations conducted on board at about 1 a.m. today, and then moving through all of their landing preparations very smoothly. Flight controllers are currently monitoring the weather at the Kennedy Space Center landing site, specifically fog that has limited visibility but is dissipating. Using reports from the shuttle training aircraft that has been flown on practice approaches to the runway by Chief Astronaut Kent Rominger, satellite imagery, ground observations from weather observers, and forecasts from the Spaceflight Meteorology Group here in Houston at Mission Control, all of that data being evaluated a final time, standing by for a decision on whether Columbia will proceed or not with this engine firing about 11 minutes away at 7:15 a.m. Central Time to lead to a touchdown in Florida at 8:16 a.m. Central. Again, a 2-minute, 38-second long firing that would occur as Columbia is over the Indian Ocean, just moving into evening to the west of Australia. It would first encounter the effects of Earth's atmosphere north of the Hawaiian Islands above the Pacific at an altitude of 75 statute miles and begin its descent into the atmosphere at that point, crossing the continental United States above the coast of California, above the San Francisco Bay Area, and just to the south of Sacramento, providing persons in that area a potentially spectacular view of the shuttle's descent through the atmosphere with superheated air, creating a plasma trail from horizon to horizon for the shuttle. It would be visible in the Sacramento-San Francisco area first at about 5:51 a.m. Pacific Standard Time for about 4 minutes, crossing that area.
From Teeter's handover, and we'll get back to you on the other side.
We copy, Houston.
We haven't forgotten about you.
Columbia would continue across the southwestern United States, allowing potential viewing from Las Vegas as well, being visible there about 5:54 a.m. Pacific Standard Time for about 2 minutes at an elevation of about 22 degrees. In the Sacramento-San Francisco area, it would be at an elevation almost directly overhead of about 78 degrees. It would also be visible from Flagstaff, Arizona, and then from Albuquerque, New Mexico, just to the south of Albuquerque as it moves towards Sunrise and Florida. At present, Columbia is targeted toward runway 33 of the shuttle landing facility, that end of the shuttle landing facility runway. To approach that runway, it would perform a right overhead 213-degree turn on its final approach to align with the runway. The runway selection continues to be evaluated based on weather conditions and the latest data here in Mission Control. That decision also pending for Columbia. So again, less than 10 minutes now to an engine firing by Columbia to begin its descent. About 9 minutes away, that would occur at 7:15 a.m. for a touchdown at 8:16 a.m. Central Time at the Kennedy Space Center's runway. The first of 2 opportunities available for landing, weather being evaluated here in Mission Control, and a decision expected very shortly. This is a live television view of the shuttle runway at the Kennedy Space Center from a camera atop the Vehicle Assembly Building. The sun well up at Kennedy as fog continues to dissipate the vicinity. Evaluating the information is Entry Flight Director Leroy Kane here in Mission Control, overseeing activities for the descent of Columbia. Providing communications with Columbia is astronaut Charlie Hobaugh. Flight Director Leroy Kane discussing weather conditions at present with forecasters here at Mission Control.
Columbia, Houston.
Go ahead, Houston.
Yeah, Rick, I guess you've been wondering, but you are go for the deorbit burn. We are going to continue to assess which runway end we prefer, but for now we are happy with the weather at KSC. You are go for the burn.
Okay, we copy go for the burn. Right now we're leaving KSC 33 in until we hear otherwise. And that would be our preference with a headwind, but I know you guys have to look at the energy as well.
And Rick, we appreciate your assessment, and that's one thing we were hoping for. There are other issues, and we'll give you the best option we can.
We copy, and we appreciate it. Also, we'll plan on PLT flying prior to the hack if everything stays the same as we were read up earlier.
We copy, Rick.
Capcom astronaut Charlie Hobaugh passing along a go to Commander Rick Husband of Columbia and his crew of 7 to come home this morning to the Kennedy Space Center at the first opportunity to fire Columbia's engines in under 6 minutes from now, about 5.5 minutes to begin its descent from orbit and an approach to the Kennedy Space Center that would have it touch down at the shuttle runway at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. Flight controllers continue to evaluate which end of the runway Columbia will approach based on weather conditions. Runway 15 or runway 33 as the ends are labeled. Both ends are acceptable at this point. It's just a matter of which one is the very best. Again, this engine firing will be a 2-minute, 38-second long firing of Columbia's twin orbital maneuvering system engines to begin its descent.
We're ready for single APU start, attempt 2.
That call from Columbia indicating that they're starting one of the 3 auxiliary power units on board the shuttle. Those are generators that supply power for the shuttle's hydraulic systems, which in turn are used to operate the elevons and rudder and speed brake, the aero surfaces of the shuttle. One of the 3 generators is started prior to this engine firing. The other 2 will be started after the engine firing is completed and while Columbia is on its descent toward the atmosphere.
Columbia, Houston, we're about 30 seconds to a teeter's handover. We may have some RADICOM on the next satellite.
Okay, Houston, we copy.
About 2.5 minutes away from an engine firing to begin Columbia's journey home to Florida this morning. Columbia moving into its final orbital sunset. It'll move into sunrise again as it descends through the atmosphere en route to Florida above the southwestern United States. Columbia is 176 miles above the Indian Ocean to the west of Australia, about 30 seconds away from the start of an engine firing to begin its descent toward Florida, completing 16 days of scientific work in orbit. This will be a 2-minute, 38-second long firing of both orbital maneuvering system engines for the shuttle, putting it on a course toward a touchdown at the Kennedy Space Center's shuttle runway at 8:16 a.m.
We copy, Houston. Thanks.
Watching over the operation of the orbital maneuvering system engines is Propulsion Officer Dean Lenort, reporting both firing now and looking good. 2 minutes and 38 seconds that both will fire to drop Columbia out of orbit, put it on a course toward its first encounters with the atmosphere at an altitude of about 75 miles above the Pacific Ocean to the north of the Hawaiian Islands. Columbia's altitude at present 175 statute miles. A little over 1.5 minutes left to go in the deorbit engine firing for Columbia, putting Columbia on course toward a touchdown in Florida at 8:16 a.m. Central Time today. About 20 seconds left in a deorbit engine firing for Columbia, beginning its descent to Earth.
Columbia, Houston, good burn, no trim required.
We copy and concur, Houston, thanks.
And we'll meet you in post-burn.
The guidance officer confirming that Columbia is right on track toward a landing at the Kennedy Space Center at 8:16 a.m. Central. Its first encounter with the atmosphere will come in about 25 minutes as it descends to an altitude of about 75 statute miles above the Pacific Ocean, north of the Hawaiian Islands. Its altitude at present, 176 statute. Several activities that will take place on board for the crew. They'll begin to power up the two remaining auxiliary power units. Those are generators, one of which was started prior to the engine firing, that supply power to the hydraulic systems on board that operate the shuttle's elevons, rudder, and speed brake, its aero surfaces. They'll also begin maneuvering the shuttle to the proper orientation for its first encounters with the atmosphere, that with the nose angled up about 40 degrees and wings level to control heating on the spacecraft, using the thermal tiles on the bottom of the spacecraft to control heating as it begins its initial descent into the upper extremes of Earth's atmosphere. As Columbia descends into the atmosphere and approaches the continental United States, it'll begin a series of 4 steep banks that it will follow through its approach all the way to the Kennedy Space Center. Those perform to dissipate speed as it descends and air pressure builds. Also, as it descends, its steering jets will control its orientation at first. They'll gradually be turned off, turning control of the spacecraft over to aero surfaces. As the shuttle transitions from spacecraft to aircraft, its elevons and ailerons and rudder will become active.
And we're ready for 303, Rick.
San Houston, here comes the maneuver.
And Rick, we're ready for the maneuver. And looking ahead, secondary actuator check not required. I'll get you a time for your forward dump in a moment.
Columbia beginning a maneuver to position it for its first encounter with the atmosphere.
Secondary actuator check not required. And we'll do the ohms, get a little power down.
We copy.
The crew also began dumping excess reaction control system propellant from the forward reaction control system steering jets, those by firing the jets to dump that propellant prior to its encounter with the atmosphere. For Columbia's descent on the flight deck at the commander's seat, Rick Husband, pilot Willie McCool to his right. In the center seat, aft center seat of the flight deck, is flight engineer Kalpana Chawla. Seated on the flight deck for landing as well is mission specialist Laurel Clark. On the middeck, the lower deck of Columbia for landing, payload specialist Ilan Ramon of the Israel Space Agency, mission specialist David Brown, and Mike Anderson, payload commander.
6-3 seconds.
Copy, 6-3 seconds.
That's a call that the forward reaction control system jets will be fired for about 63 seconds to dump all excess propellant from them before encountering the atmosphere. Columbia's descent toward Florida will take it across the breadth of the continental United States. It'll cross the west coast of the United States above the San Francisco Bay Area of California, providing a spectacular sighting opportunity for persons in the San Francisco and Sacramento, California Bay Area. For the San Francisco area, Columbia should first become visible about 5:51 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, be visible for about 4 minutes from San Francisco and Sacramento, an elevation of about 78 degrees in the pre-dawn sky of California, almost directly overhead of that area. It'll also be visible from Las Vegas as it continues its descent across the southwest United States at an elevation of about 22 degrees from Las Vegas. Visible there about 5:54 to 5:56 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. A minute or so later, it'll become visible from Albuquerque, New Mexico, moving to the south of Albuquerque, and also above Flagstaff, Arizona just before that. It'll move into sunrise as it continues east across the United States toward Florida, headed toward a touchdown there at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. Propulsion officer here reports that dump of propellant through the forward reaction and control system jets on Columbia is in progress. That going as planned. The crew also soon will start the two remaining auxiliary power units on board. Those two generators that will join a third that was started prior to the engine firing that began the shuttle's descent to generate power for the shuttle's hydraulic systems during the entry and landing. About 17 minutes away from Columbia's first encounters with the atmosphere, that occurring in altitude about 75 miles above the Pacific Ocean to the north of the Hawaiian Islands. It's Mission Control Houston, Flight Dynamics Officer here in Mission Control, Richard Jones, continuing to discuss runway options and approach for Columbia, the best possible approach for the shuttle landing facility. Columbia currently targeted toward a landing on Kennedy Space Center runway 33, end of the shuttle landing facility runway. Discussion as to whether or not that may be switched to runway 15. That decision expected as Columbia continues its descent. There's no issue with making that decision as Columbia is descending. That's been done during previous shuttle entries as well. The Flight Dynamics Officer oversees the trajectories of the shuttle and its flight as it enters the atmosphere, and also during launch.
Houston, here comes SSME high repress.
And we're ready, Willie. No deltas.
Copy, no deltas.
Columbia's altitude now 135 statute miles as it continues to descend toward the atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean. All activities going smoothly on board. Columbia on track toward a touchdown at the Kennedy Space Center shuttle landing facility runway at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. Evaluations still ongoing of runway selection, which end of the runway Columbia will approach. Currently targeted for runway 33 there, however. With Columbia on track for landing, we'll now go to the Kennedy Space Center for an update there on preparations to receive Columbia after its 16-day scientific journey.
This is Kennedy Space Center shuttle ground operations. After a flawless 16 days in orbit for Columbia, all is in readiness for its return to the shuttle landing facility. On orbit 255, Columbia will be crossing the Florida Panhandle, entering a portion of the Gulf of Mexico, and then crossing the coastline once again near Crystal River, moving inland to Orlando, and then proceeding eastward toward the Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral. Most of the final landing preparations were completed on Friday. All of the convoy vehicles and their support systems were turned on and checked out, and there was a thorough sweep of the runway to check for possible debris. That sweep was repeated again this morning. The landing team began arriving at 6 a.m. and had an initial tag-up and landing status briefing at 6:45. All team members were required to be at their assigned stations at the runway at 7:15. There was a final briefing by the convoy commander to the landing team at 7:45. The 20 landing convoy vehicles were deployed to the end of the runway at 8:15 this morning. The shuttle landing facility at KSC is 15,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, about a third longer and twice as wide as a runway at a major commercial international airport. It is located about 3 miles northwest of the Complex 39 Vehicle Assembly Building. STS-107 marks the 62nd landing of the Space Shuttle Orbiter at the KSC runway. Following landing and return to the hangar, Columbia will be deserviced and then processed for its next mission this fall. Currently, the weather observation at the shuttle landing facility has a temperature of 52 degrees with winds westerly at 5 knots. The expected high during the day today on the runway while deservicing Columbia is underway is expected to be around 69 degrees with winds from the west-northwest 12 to 18 knots. Astronaut Kent Roegemer, accompanied by educator astronaut Barbara Morgan, began flying weather reconnaissance around the Cape Canaveral vicinity at 6:15 this morning, and over the last hour and a half have been flying approaches to the runway in the shuttle training aircraft. Roegemer is reporting his observations back to Houston to weather astronaut Dwayne Carey and to the NOAA National Weather Service Spaceflight Meteorology Group. The Milo tracking station at KSC will acquire Columbia about 13 minutes before landing and will begin supplying controllers in Houston with voice, data, and telemetry communications starting about a minute later. At 11 minutes before touchdown, the orbiter will begin receiving navigation signals from the TACAN, which is the homing beacon, and the navigation signal at the shuttle landing facility. As Columbia intercepts the heading alignment circle, the first video should become available, and Columbia will cross directly overhead of the SLF, heading out over the Atlantic Ocean, making a gradual right turn toward a 7-mile final approach to runway 33. If that is the runway that is finally determined, that would be a southeast to northwest approach. Columbia's weight as it touches down on the runway will be 234,000 pounds. It will touch down at about 204 knots. After the orbiter's landing rollout is complete, there will then be the usual safety inspections, the so-called sniff checks to look for any toxic propellants which may have leaked or be venting. And the astronauts will configure switches in the cockpit for post-landing activities and participate with the KSC ground operations team to safe the vehicle. When the vehicle is deemed safe, all of the potential hazards and determination is made that there are no toxic gases around the orbiter. The purge and coolant umbilical access vehicle will move into position at the rear of the orbiter. Here we see the shuttle training aircraft with Kent Roegemer, accompanied by Barbara Morgan, making approaches to the runway, making a final assessment as to the landing conditions and the runway of choice. After the purge and cooling system connections, the crew transport vehicle will be moved into position adjacent to the orbiter access hatch on Columbia's port side, and there will be a cursory inspection of the thermal protection system tiles, the wheels, and the other landing gear systems. About 45 minutes after landing, work will also begin to remove the orbiter's external tank separation camera. A physician will board Columbia shortly after the landing convoy arrives at Columbia's position on the runway. They will conduct a brief preliminary examination of the astronauts before the crew leaves the orbiter, and then the astronauts can make preparations to disembark and enter the crew transport vehicle for further medical evaluations. Because there are several medical test objectives for the crew this time, it will be longer than usual before the astronauts leave the shuttle landing facility runway. The astronauts must remain reclined until this medical data can be collected while they are in the crew transport vehicle and through their return to the medical facilities at the astronaut quarters, which is located in the operations and checkout building about 5 miles south of the shuttle landing facility. So we expect to see only Commander Rick Husband, pilot Willie McCool, and flight engineer Dr. Kalpana Chawla leave the crew transport vehicle and do the traditional walk-around of the space shuttle orbiter. Because of the numerous life sciences experiments and test samples that must be removed from Columbia and the Space Hab while it's still on the runway, the start of the operation to tow Columbia to its hangar will not begin until very late this afternoon. Once back at the astronaut quarters, all of the crew will undergo thorough physical examinations, then have lunch and see their immediate family members, and they currently plan to go home to Houston on Sunday. Columbia's next mission is STS-118 in mid-November, planned to deliver the S5 truss segment to the International Space Station, and the 6-member crew will include NASA educator astronaut Barbara Morgan. Visibility continuing to improve as we move toward our projected 9:16 a.m. landing time, and all convoy vehicles are in position ready to support the touchdown and rollout. From the shuttle landing facility, this is the Kennedy Space Center Ground Operations Control Center.
This is Mission Control, Houston, Columbia. Altitude is now 90 miles above the Pacific Ocean to the north of the Hawaiian Islands, about 2 minutes away from entering Earth's atmosphere. All activities continue to go smoothly en route toward a touchdown at the Kennedy Space Center at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. Columbia is currently targeted toward runway 33 at the Kennedy Space Center. The runway selection continues to be discussed here in Mission Control, however, but for its approach to runway 33, Columbia would perform a right overhead turn to align with the runway of about 214 degrees. Around the heading alignment cylinder, an imaginary cylinder created by the microwave landing system for the shuttle that assists in guiding it for its final approach. Columbia's altitude now 71 statute miles as it enters Earth's atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean en route to the Kennedy Space Center. Its speed 17,000 miles per hour. Columbia with wings level and nose angled up about 40 degrees to control heating as it descends into the atmosphere. Its altitude now 68 miles. As Columbia descends into the atmosphere and approaches the continental United States, it'll perform the first in a series of 4 banks it performs as it approaches the Kennedy Space Center. The first bank to the right, then back to the left, then back to the right, and then a final bank to the left as it approaches Kennedy and the shuttle landing facility runway. Those designed to dissipate speed for the shuttle as it descends into the atmosphere toward landing. Just under 30 minutes to touchdown for Columbia now. Altitude 64 miles. Columbia's course toward Florida will take it across the continental United States, crossing the California coast above the San Francisco Bay Area and continuing across Sacramento, California, providing a spectacular view for persons in that area of Columbia's descent through the atmosphere. That observation of the shuttle would begin about 5:51 a.m. Pacific Standard Time and continue for about 4 minutes till 5:55 a.m. Pacific Time, with the shuttle at an elevation of about 78 degrees. It'll be visible as well through much of the United States Southwest, above southern Nevada and northern Arizona and central New Mexico as it continues its descent through the atmosphere, trailing a plasma trail left as it heats the atmosphere around it during its descent. Columbia's altitude now 54 miles as it continues to descend into the atmosphere. Wings level, nose angled up 40 degrees to control heating. Columbia is traveling about 17,000 miles per hour. Columbia's altitude 48 statute miles as it begins the first in a series of 4 banks to dissipate speed as it descends into the atmosphere. Banking to the right now, a steep bank of 60 degrees and approaching the west coast of the United States. Columbia speed 16,620 miles per hour. Range to touchdown at the Kennedy Space Center runway, 3,450 statute miles. Columbia in almost an 80-degree bank to the right to dissipate speed. The first of 4 banks it performs as it approaches Florida to slow down as it descends. Altitude now 47 miles, or about 248,000 feet. The shuttle speed is 16,400 miles per hour. Aboard the shuttle on the flight deck are Commander Rick Husband and pilot Willie McCool, Flight Engineer Kalpana Chawla, and Mission Specialist Laurel Clark. On the lower deck of the shuttle for entry, our Payload Commander Mike Anderson, Mission Specialist David Brown, and Payload Specialist from the Israel Space Agency, Ilan Ramon. Columbia approaching the coast of California now. It's predicted to cross the coast and be visible in the San Francisco area about 5:51 a.m. Central Time, Pacific Standard Time rather, and pass almost directly overhead of Sacramento, California. It actually crosses the California coast just to the north of the San Francisco area. Columbia is on target for runway 33 at the Kennedy Space Center Shuttle Landing Facility runway. Subject of runway selection has been discussed in Mission Control, continues to be discussed some, but in the meanwhile, at present, the original targeting for Columbia is toward runway 33, and as it approaches runway 33, it would perform a right overhead 212-degree turn to align with that runway around the heading alignment cylinder, an imaginary cylinder created by the microwave scan beam landing system at the shuttle runway that assists in the shuttle's guidance toward its final approach to the runway. Shuttle's altitude now 45 miles, speed 15,800 miles per hour, continuing in a right bank with wings angled 70 degrees, the first of 4 banks it performs to dissipate speed as it approaches landing. Columbia crossing the California coast, again just to the north of the San Francisco area. Its course will take it across Sacramento, California. Columbia continuing in a right bank, wings angled 43 degrees. Speed 15,000 miles per hour. Altitude 43 miles. 2,090 miles to touchdown at the Kennedy Space Center. Targeted for runway 33 at Kennedy at present. crossing the continental United States, now crossing above southern Nevada to the north of Las Vegas. Columbia's course continuing across Arizona and at the Arizona-New Mexico border near the Four Corners area of the United States. Its course will take it almost directly above Albuquerque, New Mexico. Its altitude now 225,000 feet or 42 miles. Speed 14,300 miles per hour. 1,785 miles to touchdown at the Kennedy Space Center. It's banking now back to the left, the second in a series of 4 banks that dissipate speed of the spacecraft as it becomes an aircraft and descends into the atmosphere toward Florida. Wings angled about 75 degrees to the left. Columbia continuing toward Florida, now approaching the New Mexico-Texas border. Altitude 40 miles. Speed 13,200 miles per hour. Range to touchdown 1,400 miles. The shuttle in the left bank with wings angled about 57 degrees to horizontal.
And Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages and we did not copy your last.
Roger,
Columbia out of communications at present with Mission Control as it continues its course toward Florida. "14 minutes to touchdown for Columbia at the Kennedy Space Center. Flight controllers are continuing to stand by to regain communications with the spacecraft.
Columbia, Houston, comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
Capcom Charlie Hobaugh calling Columbia on UHF frequency as it approaches the Merritt Island tracking station range in Florida. 12.5 minutes to touchdown according to clocks in Mission Control.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check. Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
Flight controllers are standing by for Columbia to move within communications range of the Merritt Island tracking station in Florida. To regain communications with Columbia. Also, flight controller standing by for tracking data of Columbia that also received through the Merritt Island tracking station.
UHF comm check.
Ten and a half minutes to anticipated touchdown for Columbia. Flight controllers are still standing by for C-band tracking data from the Merritt Island Tracking Station of Columbia and UHF communications.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
No.
8 minutes on the touchdown clock for Columbia. Flight controllers continuing to stand by to regain communications with the spacecraft. Flight controllers standing by for communications through the Merritt Island Tracking Station, a ground tracking site in Florida. This is Mission Control Houston. Flight controllers are continuing to seek tracking data of Columbia. Touchdown clocks count down to 6 minutes to touchdown for the anticipated touchdown of Columbia at the Kennedy Space Center runway. Tracking data is being sought through the Merritt Island Tracking Station located near the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Communications with Columbia were lost at about 8 a.m. Central Time, about 10 minutes ago. This is Mission Control Houston. Flight controllers are continuing to stand by for communications from Columbia. The last communications with the spacecraft occurred about 8 a.m. Central Time as it was above Central Texas. Currently seeking communications or tracking data from the spacecraft through C-band radar and ground tracking sites located at the Merritt Island Tracking Station in Florida. This is Mission Control Houston. Flight controllers continue to seek tracking or communications with Columbia through Merritt Island Tracking Station. Last communications with Columbia was at 8 a.m. Central Time, approximately above Texas as it approached the Kennedy Space Center for its landing. Flight Director Leroy Kane is now instructing controllers to get out their contingency procedures and begin to follow those. The flight dynamics officer reports no tracking data from C-band radar at the Merritt Island Tracking Station has been reported of any objects. This is Mission Control Houston. Flight Director Leroy Kane is instructing controllers to follow contingency procedures. The last communications with the Shuttle Columbia during its descent from orbit were at about 8 a.m. Central Time as it was descending through the atmosphere. At an altitude of about 207,000 feet, en route to the Kennedy Space Center, Florida, and a touchdown that was anticipated to occur about 2.5 minutes ago. Flight controllers received no further communications with the spacecraft after about 8 a.m. Central Time, and no further tracking data from the spacecraft was gained from C-band tracking radar at the Merritt Island tracking station in Florida. Contingency procedures in effect in mission control require all operators to conserve all their data and log books and notes that have been taken, that being instructed by Flight Director Leroy Kane, for controllers to begin following those steps and secure all information. Again, Flight Director Leroy Kane has declared a contingency. Flight controllers here in Mission Control are securing all their information, notes, and data gathered from the spacecraft. The last communications with Columbia at 8 a.m. Central Time as it was descending toward Florida for its landing. At that time, about 207,000 feet above central Texas, traveling approximately 12,500 miles per hour, 1,192 miles from its touchdown at Kennedy Space Center. Since 8 a.m., no communications were received with Columbia and no tracking data received through the Merritt Island tracking station. Those efforts made, the flight dynamics officer reports no objects tracked through that tracking data.